Okay, good morning. Now, Len told me I've got 2 hours, so we can go to about midday. Is that right? And the other thing is, if you start to go to sleep, that's all right. But if you start tapping your watch, then I really get worried. And someone, lovely person here, where is she? I can't see her sitting. She said, oh, over there. She said she doesn't like academics because they come along and they talk. And And after she'd given this, how pathetic academics are at giving presentations, I said, well, actually, I was a lecturer at university for 14 years. But she did say rather nice things about my last talk. A couple of introductions. First of all, I brought along my minder, John Swanston up the back there, who just lives not very far from here at the moment, and he's come along to keep me honest. So say hello to John when you get a chance. The second thing is I am very embarrassed because I looked over my shoulder and I saw Tattersalls February 2024. I forgot to make the change. So I just wanted you to know that my last talk was actually a bit more upmarket than. So here I am. But anyway, it is still good for what I want to do. The other thing which I would do by way of introduction is that I did a double history political science degree at the Australian National University as part of my growing up, I guess. And one of the people who I'm sure, and I really am name dropping, Manning Clark was my lecturer. You want me to stand back a bit? I was just looking at the video there. That's better, isn't it? So, so I thought I've got a few hair out of place if I can find them. Manny Clark was my lecturer tutor and quite a brilliant man. Turned out to be a little bit lefty later on that we didn't know about. He'd apparently been awarded the Lenin Peace Prize, unbeknownst to the university or unbeknownst to many of us. But one of the things he emphasised about history, which I've taken on board, is he said it's really quite easy to determine dates and facts that are pretty well established, like when did the Nazis invade Poland, or when did the Wall Street crash occur, and you get those dates sorted out, or when did Governor Phillip land at Botany Bay. But he said history is really about people and what was the role of those various people in those particular events that we often talk about. And you might recall when I was talking about the Stinson, I looked at the 7 different people who decided that they would take that flight. And those women in the audience would recall that I blamed a woman for the crash of the Stinson because I did. And the co-pilot was very determined to go back to Sydney that evening because he had a red hot date. However, it wasn't the only reason that it was that crash. But with this particular story too, what I'm trying to do is to look at Burke and Wills. And if I could just have an aside for a moment, I'm very interested in the white explorers because I have a direct ancestral connection to the Hume and Hovell expedition, which of course went from what we now know as downtown Goulburn in New South Wales down to Port Phillip Bay. And one of the assigned servants to Hume was a chap by the name of Henry Angel, who was, I think, my great-grandfather about 6 generations removed. So I've always had this interest in how the white explorers moved about in our country, particularly during the 1800s. And Burke and Wills has been a work in progress, but I'm pretty well comfortable with as far as I know about it. But I did start to work on Leichhardt. And I don't know, does anyone in this audience know much about Leichhardt or... Oh, someone's waving their hand. And I gave my first talk, and there was a rather interesting lesson in this. I gave my first talk out at the men's shed at Belbowery, and I didn't say, does anyone know much about Leichhardt? And anyway, I started to talk, and I gave what I thought was a reasonable presentation. And then at the end of it, there was this chap who I vaguely knew who started to ask some fairly interesting questions. And then I said to him, you seem to know quite a bit about Leichhardt. He said, yes, I did my PhD on one of Leichhardt's journeys. And I thought, oh, I wish I'd known about that. But fortunately, I don't know. And I've just spoken to Len. I'm working up the Leichhardt story, which in a way has a little bit of a connection to Burke and Wills, because Leichhardt went through part of this area before Burke and Wills did. particularly where they crossed over in what we now know as central Queensland. But I find it remarkable that Leichhardt was able fairly easily, almost by accident, to travel up from present-day Brisbane or up to a place called Port Essington, which is not very far from Darwin Harbour, or Darwin as we know it. But the country between the last leg or the last few months of his trip, his exploration, and he was the first white explorer to do it, particularly up there in the north corner of the Northern Territory. It was very rough country. And I've been fairly intrigued to see what a topography map would show of that area, because it must have been very difficult to get through in that last leg. So I was asking Len if there's some way I could just see what it looks like. Anyway, I think what he did, or his party did, is they consulted their local Aboriginal people about how they could get through that area. And I think that was part of the answer. However, coming back to Burke and Wills, the title that I've put there is Tragedy or Triumph. And this is an artistic rendition of the departure. It, even to this day, is probably the most expensive, biggest exploration that was ever mounted in our white history, and I don't think anyone else tried. And it was fraught with difficulties almost from the very beginning. And there you can see the grandeur of it. They had basically two groups, horses. Burke is the leader, and I have to say right at the start that I don't like him, I don't respect him, so I'm going to be quite negative about him. But if you form a different opinion, then please feel free to do that. But I'll explain shortly why that's the case. So there we have the artist's rendition of what that beginning was like, with Burke in the middle there on his white charger. And he had certainly ideas of grandeur. Now, let me just make sure that I've got, yes. The Victorian Exploration Expedition, as it was known then, began in 1860 and sort of concluded in 1861. We now know it as the Burke and Wills Expedition. Wills was not initially the the deputy in charge. He was asked to do it after the other fellow Landells decided he wouldn't really work with Burke, and I'll come to that. But there's some artists, actually, I think one of them might have been based on a photograph, but that's them. Wills was a young chap, and I'll come back to him and I'll tell you a bit more about Burke and Wills shortly. Now, as some of you might know, I'm a print journalist by profession, and I did also lecture in journalism, and you're not allowed to smirk when I say this because I did take it seriously. For about 14 years, I lectured at QUT, and one of my specialities was journalism ethics. And there is such a thing, there's an ethical code, and we did try to imbue some ethical standards in journalism, although I look at some of the journalism today and I wonder. But this was an editorial that appeared after the death of 3 out of the 4 of the party, although there were 9 deaths totally from the whole expedition. And this was almost British sort of tabloid stuff. And I'll read it out. The name of Robert O'Hara Burke is henceforth to be a precious possession of the people of Victoria. The glory of his deed and the sorrow of his death will render that name memorable in the annals of our country. And well may Victoria be proud of this, her first hero. The story of his great achievement, if it is the saddest, is also one of the highest in the history of mankind or manhood. No fiction was ever so half romantic, no hero more valiant, bold or loyal, no conqueror dying on the field of battle could earn a fame more glorious. Wow. I really can't say much, can I? But let me go ahead. That's how the editorial appeared at the day of his funeral. Right, let's talk a little bit about what was known about our continent at that stage. And the white areas are those areas that were sort of known to the white explorers. And let me say right at the start, of course, the Aboriginal people knew what was around in the continent. So we can't say it was unknown, but it wasn't known to white explorers, and it wasn't known particularly well for pastoralists or people who wanted to expand into the continent. And in 1858, there was this vast interior, the Black Area, which wasn't known to white explorers. And you'll see, as I was talking about Leichhardt, and I don't know if you've got a pointer here, but it doesn't matter. That area there was opened up by Leichhardt. So the area had not been crossed from Queensland, and I'll use present day locations, into the Gulf country until it went up there into the Northern Territory. So that was done a couple of years before in 1848, and it still was largely unexplored. And of course, the drive was on for land. You know, there was too many people who wanted to, you know, graze sheep and raise crops. So there was a lot of pressure to find out what was going on between the north and south of the continent. And there were competing interests for that too, because the South Australia were keen to get a telegraph through, and I'll come to that shortly. And Victoria had wealth. And if you look at the date that we're talking about, 1858, 1859, what had happened just before that? Gold rush. And Melbourne became, I'm told at that stage, the wealthiest capital city in the entire British Empire. The amount of gold that was going through, I've heard rumours about, you know, there was tons of gold, but certainly there was a lot of money that had been raised through gold in the gold fields. And of course, quite a bit of that went into government coffers, and that made them a very wealthy sponsor, so to speak, of the exploration north of Melbourne and west of Brisbane and part of the continent. And of course, there was also still, even at that date, a bit of a belief that there was an inland sea, which would have made that particular area very arable. As we now know, there was no inland sea that was really available for farming. So that's the difference. And so actually the Burke and Wills exploration was very important because it did open up a lot more of the country. And to preempt the story a little bit, it wasn't always so much about Burke and Wills, but because they got into a lot of trouble, some of the other explorers went out looking for them. So a lot more of the continent was opened up because of the subsequent searches for them. Have any of you been to the famous Dictory? Yeah, I haven't been there since 2015. Has anyone been there more recently? Oh, have you? Okay. It's been pretty well protected, hasn't it? The thing you may know, is anyone else in this room a member of the Queensland Historical Society? No, Carol and I am. It's a good group of people. They've got Customs House down there, which means that actually if you need to park in the city, you can just drive in, or you used to be able to drive in around all the building and park your car down the bottom there and get free parking for the city for the rest of the day. So I was quite happy to pay my membership for that. No, the interesting thing about it is they are the custodians of the Dictory area. The Queensland Historical Society have responsibility for it. And the actual Dictory itself was dying, and they got an arborist in, and the tree, I'm told, is... Did you see the tree when you were there? Is it looking okay? Apparently it's recovered. You're not sure. You didn't probably look closely enough, but it
was in trouble.
Okay, you didn't know it was in trouble. What was also good about it is that Dick Smith, about 10 years ago, donated $1.5 million to redevelop and to protect the area because people were trumping up towards the tree, and the soil, of course, was getting hard. And then they put wooden planks, and I think they would be there. And they also put in a airstrip so that some people can actually fly in there, have a look at the Dictory and fly out again. But it's not too hard. It's quite easy to get there. It's mostly, did you drive in? Yeah, it's bitumen pretty well all the way, isn't it? Apart from the last bit, isn't it?
Yeah, you turn off the road in Aminka,
yeah,
and you go in there.
But it's not very far on Unsteel Road, is it?
It's a bit rocky.
Yeah. Of course, like most things in the interior of Australia, you have to watch the weather. If it's wet, you can't make much progress. Anyway, that's the brochure that I have, which you can get out there, and it's got some. It was known as Camp 65, which I want you to try and remember. over on the left-hand side there's 4 names that I want you to try and recall. You get Burke, Wills, King and Gray. Now, the significance of those 4 people, or they're the only ones who went right up as far as the Gulf, because the party split a number of times, which was a problem. But those 4 people were the 4 that actually made it to the Gulf, or almost to the Gulf. Only one of them survived, King. Now, that's just the portraits of them. Before they started, and it's one of those crazy government decisions that when it went wrong and when people started to question the wisdom of it, is no one was accountable. No one could actually pin it down and to say, oh, yes, we chose Burke and we did that. If it had been a success, they all would have said, yes, that was me, that's how I did it. But it's a typical government thing. If something's stuffed up, what, me? No. And they all sort of point around and no one takes responsibility. It's very typical of even present day government. You know, if a decision's made, you know, if it goes bad, you don't. But one of the things, they had an enormous amount of money. And this is just 1 or 2 pages of their provisions. And if you look carefully, there's some extraordinary things in there. For example, they had firewood. They had 60 gallons of rum. They had a bathtub. They had a dining table. You know, they had all of these things which you sort of think, who thought this one through? And it wasn't as if they hadn't had other explorers. There were other explorers who'd been out in the bush before. And you just sort of think, they had far too much money, and they said that the rum was for the camels. They left Melbourne on the 30th of August, 1860, and apparently it was a humongous public display of Victoria wealth, and you know, people came out and cheered them on. And there's only one photograph that was ever taken of it, and it's that left one down the bottom, which doesn't tell us a lot, but they had covered wagons. One of the things that they did, which was quite brilliant, had not been done in Australian white exploring before, is someone had rather brilliantly thought about camels. So they got there was a chap there who got a couple of camels from the circus, but then they brought about another 20 camels in from, I'm never sure of this, I think it's India, but then they had a cameleer. So one of the successes of the Burke and Wills expedition was the first time they used camels to work in the Australian outback, which was, of course, quite brilliant. And I'll come back to that. But the thing got off to a pretty bad start. Now, these are the names of some of the people on the expedition, and I've tried to highlight a few of them. They had an enormous number to start off with, but the key people there were Burke, and George Landells was supposed to be the deputy. But like a lot of people, as it occurred, he couldn't work with Burke, and they had a huge argument, as did quite a few other people. And there's 2 Germans in there who you really need to, and they got very similar names, which is confusing. One was Hermann Beckler, and he was a very decent fellow. He was a medical doctor, and he was supposed to be there to look after the the medical requirements of the party. And then there's another fellow by the name of Becker. And I feel very sorry for Becker because he was an older man, and Burke was a bully, and he bullied him. And I think he brought about his death, actually. I think he bullied him so much. But I've got a very precious book here, which is pretty hard to come by, but was gifted to me by a lovely friend of ours. And he was a brilliant artist. He also paid a lot of attention to the flora and fauna. And I'll pass the book around, so be a little careful with it, but have a look at some of his drawings and paintings. And they're some of the primary documents that we have of the expedition. Here you go, Len. And I'll come back to some of his material. So Becker was an important person. If you had looked down quickly, there's Dost Mohammed. He was the initial cameleer. And then you have John King down a bit further, and he was the only survivor of those 4 who got to the Gulf. And I'll move on. Okay, this gets down to the party again. Now, let me talk first of all about Wills, who was a young son of a doctor, quite brilliant, a really good scientist and very meticulous. He kept a very fine diary, and he was one of the few. John Wills' father was very upset about the fact that his son had died on that expedition, and he was the one who really forced the Royal Commission into the success or otherwise of the expedition. John King was quite a simple lad, and the only survivor, as I said, of those 4 who went up to the Gulf. Gray was almost an accidental member, and I don't know how keen you are on grammar. Have you heard the word gammoning or to gammon? Do you know what? It's an old phrase, and it's used actually in Wills's diary, and I've picked it up in some other areas. I think the closest meaning to it today would be bludging or stealing when you shouldn't. And Burke reckons that Gray was gammoning, and that was that he was they'd allocated out the supplies when they became quite short. And he found that Gray had taken more than his fair share. Now, I will jump ahead again. I'm probably spoiling it.
Backgammon.
Yeah, it may be connected, but if you look up the word, it is apparently was a much more commonly used word back in the 1800s, and it meant someone who's taking advantage of other people and sort of swinging the lead, bludging on the rest of us. I think it's a remarkable word, and I could think of a few people that I could apply it to. But there you go. Have a go at seeing if you can use the word gammoning. But anyway, in the diary, it says that Gray was guilty of gammoning, and sadly, Burke gave him a hiding, and I think actually killed him, brought about his premature death. So another reason why I don't like Burke, because I think he was guilty maybe of murder, but that's yet to be revealed. Right, what did they decide to do? They just took off from Melbourne. They didn't get very far on the first day. They got, what is it, about 16 kilometres, about 8 or 9 miles. And they basically went straight north, which from a navigational point of view was dead easy. You woke up, the sun came up in the east and the sun went down the west, so you just headed straight up, which was great if the country was flat and easy and you could do it. What they didn't do is, have any of you had much to do with Aboriginal people? Have heard the term songlines? And someone like to explain what songlines are?
It's their ritual, cultural paths that they follow.
And they sing to each other. And yes, the songlines are passed on by various Aboriginal people, and they will sing them because they know that this is the best way to go and where you get your water and you follow the country. Here I'm going to get into trouble because I know you're mapping people. Basically, that part of the continent runs from north to south. If you look at the way, and I think this is pretty right. These men decided they'd just go straight north, wouldn't care about the country, wouldn't care about the songlines. The Aboriginal people wouldn't know what they were talking about, so why would you bother talking to them? And Burke was so arrogant that he just said, no, compass tells us to go north, that's the way we'd go. And they sometimes didn't even consult the Aboriginal people about where the nearest water was. But if they'd followed the songlines, obviously they would have weaved their way up on the best routes to take and probably got there a lot faster and a lot easier. But they chose not to follow the songlines, which is another reason why the party got into trouble, because they thought, well, we're white people, we know better, we've got a lot more experience than you. And of course, at times they encountered some hostile Aboriginal people as well. But and of course, coming back south, if you're coming back south, they did basically follow their route that they'd taken north, so coming back south. So from a navigational point of view, if you didn't care about the country or the terrain, it was dead easy, head north, head south. That's all you had to do. The most interesting area is around the Dig Tree, which I've enlarged there, a place called Cooper Creek. It's not Cooper's Creek, it's Cooper Creek. A lot of people put an S on it. And it was known, and it was true, that it was pretty well a permanent water source. So it was a good base to stage really the last camp before the 4 of them went north. And that's the one from Inaminka where you can go and and find out quite a bit about it. And that's Camp 65. Each of the camps were numbered as they went north. And of course, they put blazers on the trees. And that was another way that they could actually track their route. They had problems before they even started. One of the wagons broke down within a few hundred metres. The idea of taking American, US covered wagons, as we see in the Western movies, wasn't really very smart at all once they got into some of the country that they were supposed to travel in. Of course, they had all this enormous amount of equipment. Some of them turned up drunk on the departure and they were sacked. Burke, how old was he? 42. He was infatuated with a 16-year-old, quite a well-known singer by the name of Julia Matthews. And that's her a little bit older down there, but she was quite gorgeous. And he decided that he would go off and propose to Julia. And Julia was a single mum. And so he left his party on the first night. And he went off to see Julia and ask her if she would marry him. Basically, Mum said, "Piss off, you're too old. Don't want you as a son-in-law." And he was a bit chided. Anyway, she gave him a lock of her hair to take on the expedition, which was very interesting because when they went through Wills's body, they found that there was another lock of her hair in Wills's possessions as well. There you go. What was going on here? Landl's was probably a very competent bushman, and I think had he stayed on, he found it too difficult to work with Will, so he quit at Menindee, which is part of the way up. They staged some of the camps, and they broke up the camps too many times. Becker had a huge falling out with Burke, and he was a pretty decent fellow, but he was concerned about the medical side of the party, and he sort of stayed on as a de facto advisor. And I think had they listened more to him, they probably wouldn't have suffered the 9 deaths that actually occurred on the expedition. They then didn't have a doctor. As I said, Burke was cruel to the oldest member of Becker. And yes, and he used to force him to actually unload all of the gear, and he was the oldest man, and he found it quite difficult to do it. And even under those circumstances, he took notes and he wrote them as he was going on the camel, and that's some of the material that he produced, which is very valuable as a historical document to what actually happened. Right, jumping ahead, they left Cooper Creek, and I won't go into the complexities of that, but there were some timing issues that occurred which created the ultimate tragedy, and that was that the party of 4 had been unseasonal rain, so it was quite wet, and so Burke, not being the true bushman he should have been, thought, hey, this is pretty good, we're going to have water all the way up, which was good in one sense, but it became difficult to transfer or to get through some of the wet areas. But they took off just at the beginning of the wet season, really, and of course it was very hot. And they constantly, and particularly in Burke's diary, he talks about the mosquitoes, the flies, and all of the uncomfortable things that you get at that time of the year in the northern tropics or the northern semi-tropical areas of our continent. But they basically went north. Now, the interesting thing is they never actually saw the sea, which was the aim. They didn't actually get to stand in the salt water at the beach because it was mangroves. But they did get to an area pretty close to that because there was a rise and fall of the tide. So they knew that they had got quite close. And there is a place not very far from Normanton, where you can actually see what I think might be the second last camp, but we'll talk about that shortly. The party was split far too many times, which caused problems with their supplies, with the food that they had, and they started to starve. And they also, it was quite amazing. Who was the first person who really discovered the antidote to scurvy in our history? Cook. Yeah, Cook knew about scurvy, and he, even though the sailors hated it, he fed them up on sauerkraut, and in fact, he became renowned for the fact that none of his crew ever died of scurvy because he forced them. In fact, I think there was one of his crew who refused to eat it, and he was flogged until he did eat it. So yeah, there was and when was Cook's voyage? 70. Yeah, almost, sort of 80 years earlier. Yet Burke was so stupid, he left the lime and he left the sort of the stuff that could have solved scurvy. So some of the party started to suffer from scurvy quite a lot later on. I just found, okay, probably I should tell you a little bit more about Burke, and we'll come to him. There's the timelines. I won't go into that too closely, but it does. They took off in August 1860. They found evidence that Burke and Wills had died about June 1861. King was the only survivor, who was found in September 1861, and then they had a state funeral in 1863. So, there was quite a gap. But the essential period is between August and April, which was the time they went up and came back. Let me move on. Let me talk a bit about Burke for a moment. He was an Irish Protestant. He was a frustrated military man, and he went off and joined the Austrian or one of the Bavarian units. And he came out as a police officer, and he was in charge of the police and also the prison at Beechworth. And if you go to Beechworth, there's a beautiful sort of engraved image of him there. But apparently he was so pathetic in one sense that he often used to go out and visit people at homesteads and get lost on the way back. So his bushman's craft was non-existent. How he got appointed is still a puzzle. And I think the Victorians were very keen to have a Victorian lead this wonderful expedition. There were some other people in the offering, but they weren't from Victoria, so they weren't selected. And as I said, it's very hard to find out who made the decision. Even the Royal Commission couldn't actually pin it down. I think it became a group, but no one put up their hand and said, hey, what does this man know about leading a party? What experiences he had? What does he know about the Australian bush? And the other thing is he disliked the Aboriginal people. He had quite a strong racist view towards the Aboriginal people, which wasn't uncommon then. I mean, some people regarded them as savage. Sadly, some of them in the early part of white settlement regarded them as vermin, get rid of them because they're not useful for our purposes. So I don't have a huge respect for Burke, and maybe I shouldn't sort of state it to you. Wills, on the other hand, I think became very loyal to Burke, which is a great thing, but he was quite young and naive, and I don't think he realised that Burke wasn't the sort of leader that they needed for such an expedition. But he was very meticulous, and he did have some really good scientific qualities, and so his understanding of what they were doing was much better than probably most of them, with the exception of the two German fellows. Okay, Charlie Gray, we don't know a lot about him. He was a bit of a simple lad. He was more the gopher. And John King was the one who was supposed to be looking after the camels, knew a bit about camelling. And he became a bit of a hero, in my opinion, because he was the last survivor of those three. They did this final push from Cooper Creek, which was a fair way. There was quite a bit of distance to be covered, which initially worked out quite well because they had the camels. And they got to Camp 119, and that was supposedly the most northern of the camps. Have any of you been to that? It's on, if you want to make a trip, we did it on a bus trip as well. I had been up to that country a few times before because Carol and I worked at Doomadgee as volunteers in the Aboriginal mission there quite a few years ago, which is not too far from Burketown. And this is the same sort of area. But there's a trip you can do called the Savannah Way. And it's really quite a wonderful trip, and I would recommend it. So these photographs were taken when we were on a bus tour a couple of years ago. Now, I think it was rather funny, this. Being a journalist, I like to ask questions, and I was talking to one of the locals, and it's all set up, that this was the last camp that they had, Camp 119. They got plaques up and lots of information about it. And I was talking to one of the locals, and he said, well, that's actually not where the camp was. We moved it away for 100 metres because we didn't want tourists to be tramping in the original site. Thank you. So, everything you see isn't always what it's meant to be. But there is some suggestion, and this comes from Will's diary, that two of them actually made an extra camp a little bit because it says they went away for the night. And I think they were trying to get close to see if they could see the sea, because there was also some suggestion that if they got to the Gulf, that a vessel might come around and pick them up and sort of return them back to civilization or back to where they could get help. But I don't think they made it, but I do think there was a Camp 120, and there's a few other researchers who support that view. Anyway, that's there. There was disaster on the way back. Lots of things went wrong. The food ran out. They were suffering from scurvy. They were suffering from various vitamin deficiency. And Gray was found pilfering. Sadly, I think it was Wills who dobbed him in. And so Burke took discipline. I suppose you could justify it. If you're fighting for your survival and one of your party actually starts thieving the food that was allocated out to the others, then you could say that's a pretty poor thing to do. Anyway, he gave him a fair beating, and he didn't survive much longer. I think he was beaten on about a week, and then he died a week later, which was also a tragedy because, just jumping ahead, they got back to the dig tree the afternoon of the morning when the other party had left, but they stopped to bury Gray's, and it took them an extra day to bury Gray because they didn't want the Aboriginal people to be interfering with his remains. And so that 1 day delay became critical when they got back to Cooper Creek. It's also interesting that I attended, and I had to give a talk at the Historical Society a few years ago, and there was a chap there whose surname is Pigeon, who knows more about this expedition than I do. And I said to him, have they ever found Gray's grave? And he said, no, but there are some people who claim they know where it is, but no one has actually found the site where Gray was buried, which I'll come back to a little bit later. Well, Burke and Wills didn't survive very long after that. Burke had a pistol and he was going to take his own life. Wills wrote in his diary, he was very emotionally upset about Burke's impending death, and he wrote very beautifully about that, but he also wrote a lovely letter to his father. And it's quite heartrending to read. It gives us a very interesting insight into Wills. And I'm sort of quite proud of the way he behaved. He was very loyal. I think his loyalty was misplaced. But King survived, and he didn't really know what to do with himself. He was suffering some pretty major health issues, and he was befriended by the local Aboriginal group. Initially, they didn't really want to have much to do with him, but apparently he took them to the grave sites of Burke and Wills, and they showed some empathy towards him. And then because he had a musket, he was able to shoot some game for them, is they looked after him until he was found in September. There's also a very strong rumour, I'll put it, at the conference I was at, we were supposed to have an Aboriginal chap come and talk to us who claimed that there was a descendant of King, and it's quite likely that one of the women would have been close to King and fathered a child. And that's been quite, there's been quite a bit of evidence to support that there is a descendant of King who was, he was the father of the Aboriginal tribe that looked after him. The camels sort of saved their bacon a bit. They returned to the Camp 65, and I've got this out of order a little bit, and I'm sorry. Brana had just left that morning. They found some supplies, which Brana had left there, and that's the famous dig tree, and they'd covered it over because they were concerned that the Aboriginal people would dig it up and take it. A series of disasters. The Brans party had been told to wait for 3 months. They waited for 4 months and they left on the morning, which is really very sad because had the timings been a little bit closer. And as it turned out, his Brans party was only about 16 miles to the south. Burke didn't realise that, and they sort of resupplied themselves. But then Burke decided to head to the west, out to what we now know as Mount Hopeless. Shouldn't have done that. He would have been far better off going after the other group, but they claim, and Wills' diary says this, they didn't have enough energy to do that. They felt that it was... so they then reburied the items, and Brun had a bit of a conscience, and he sent right back one of the other members of his party to see if the Burke and Wills group had got back there. and they'd covered it all up, but they hadn't left a note or anything to say they'd been there. And so Wright came back and said, no, haven't arrived at the camp, whereas in fact they had. So there were a series of missed opportunities and tragedies there. By June, King was the only one alive. That's the famous painting of Burke's death with Wills next to him. Alfred Howard, who was a very good bushman and a very good explorer, came in from the South Australian side, and a number of groups went in to try and find out what had happened to the Burke and Wills expedition. And he found, that's an etching, he found King quite disoriented, but he had been, he was still alive and he was pretty fragile. So Howard packed him off, waited for him to recover, and they came back via South Australia, which is probably the better route that they could have taken under those circumstances. I could talk a lot about Becker and Beckler, and I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at those, some of those really great paintings. There's a couple of them, they're in that book, and they're in the, there's a couple of them in the St Kilda Victoria Library, I think, and also Beechworth, but they're very important paintings, and you can see he was a very skilled artist. And there's some other ones that he did, and he did take a few. He seemed to have quite a sympathetic view of the Aboriginal people, and he painted them or drew them in a very respectful way. And these are a couple of the Aboriginal groups that were around their camps at various stages. And one of those is very interesting because you get the chap sitting down there with a pipe. So someone supplied him with a Western pipe. And some of the Aboriginal people were quite friendly, but Burke didn't really trust them and didn't really want to have much to do with them. And of course, there were some attacks. They had to put up a stockade, and you can read about that in Will's diaries. The famous dig tree, I've told you the story about that. Now, the dig tree is not the big tree that you see there. It's the tree off to the side, and that's it there. And that's when I was there in 2015. I'd like to go back again. And the carving that you can actually see in it was done by a stockman some years later. So the actual blaze is no longer, you can't actually see it any longer. And that's how they've got it preserved. And that's the dig tree is the tree over here. A lot of people mistake the dig tree for the big tree there. Sorry, the bigger tree there. I'll rush through to get the last. Now, Cooper Creek is where they had this staging camp, and as you can see, there's a lot of water in there, and there were, surprisingly, they hardly fished. You know, they sort of running out of supplies, and they didn't try and fish very much at all. They ended up eating crows and snakes, and you know, they also poisoned themselves with a. Are there any botanists in the room? The bidoo. The supporters had their troubles. While they were waiting there, they were attacked by some Aboriginal people who came in who didn't want them around and wanted some of their supplies, and they had to build a stockade, which was there until the 1900s, and it fell into disrepair. They were honoured as heroes. They went back. Howard, who was the very seasoned bushman who found King, he went and found the remains again. He was sent back up. I don't think there was much left. I think if you think about the decomposition of two bodies after about 8 months, so they wrapped them in the British Union Jack and took them back to Melbourne. And there's just a rendition. You can see the various search parties, particularly the ones that went out from Queensland, and they opened up a lot more of the country. So the success of the Burke and Wills expedition wasn't so much that they traversed from north to or from south to north, but all these other parties that went in there looking for them, and that opened up a lot more country to white settlement. They had the wrong team, and they didn't have survival skills. They did have an Aboriginal chap there, Dick, who was apparently quite brilliant. He was a lovely fellow, knew he could negotiate with the Aborigines. We don't know what happened to him. He took off. He got sick of Burke, and he decided he wasn't going to be part of this group. Whether he died or survived, we don't know. There's no record of what actually happened to him. I think he died. I think he was out of his country and probably didn't survive. But that's a painting of him that Becker did, which apparently if they'd listened to him, he probably could have saved their lives. The Nadu plant, this is where I get out of my territory a bit. They had noticed that the Aboriginal people were using a sort of a flour, which would have protected them from scurvy, and they were eating it raw. And apparently that wasn't the right way to deal with the Nadu plant. You had to grind it, and you had to leave it, and you had to water it, and then you could eat it. If you ate it in its raw state, it poisoned you, which is what happened. So they poisoned themselves. Once again, they didn't sort of talk to the Aboriginal people and say, how do you use the Nadu plant? And that was, of course, one of the big failures of this particular expedition. I've already spoken to you about the song lines. Wills was the principal navigator and simply headed north-south to watch the sun. Failure to ask the local Aboriginal people the best way to go and where to get water. And of course, there was another thing is, we probably do know this, that if you go onto a different area in, well, not so much now, of course, but then the tribal boundaries were quite strict. You actually had to get permission. And what, I've picked up from my research and also being at Doomadgee, in the old days, you just sat on the border, whatever the border was, you knew who's, and you waited until someone came along and said, yeah, okay, it's okay for you to come through, or it's not okay for you to come through. And one of the things which we don't probably fully appreciate, there's quite a bit of hostility between the various camps, the groups. And one of the reasons was because if they needed a couple of young women, they'd go in and grab and, take off the young women. And of course, some tribes didn't like that. And so there was quite a bit of anger and fighting and deaths as a result of that intertribal conflict, and was mostly over women. And of course, to some extent, if it was a bad season, as to where the water was and where they could get their food source. One of the things that I found out, and I was in the Stockman Hall of Fame at Winton, and I picked this up, the Afghans don't use the camel to ride on it. They use them as carriers of their materials. So the camel was used outside of Australia, not to ride on, but to supply, your equipment and to load up. Whereas the party here used it partly to ride on, but also they were very good as beasts of burden. Right, what caused their illness and what caused all their deaths? Well, there was scurvy, beriberi, malnutrition, exhaustion, hypothermia, poisoning, and a failure to watch, listen and learn from the Aboriginal. Now, I've got a little bit of a puzzle here because I was down in Melbourne quite recently and found that the statue, which was in downtown Melbourne, has been moved. And I understand the Melbourne City Council have put it in storage and are not sure where to relocate it. But it was the biggest statue ever made and erected in Australia. And that's it there. Have any of you recall seeing that in downtown Melbourne? I don't know if you can get the size of it there. It's huge. Probably it would be 30, 40, 50 feet high. It's quite large and it cost a lot of money. It has panels on the side of it. But this was the state funeral, and it was modelled on Wellington's funeral after the Battle of Waterloo. You sort of think it's quite, and they actually copied the carriage. They had service people with their arms reversed, and that was part of the scene, the massive funeral that was held in Victoria to hail these heroic figures who the state funeral. And I've already read you how the Argus reported it. Invitations went out. They declared a public holiday. It was an exact replica of Duke of Wellington's. They had bands. The shops and houses were draped. The soldiers reversed arms. And the grave that they eventually interned them in says, comrades in great achievement, companions in death, and associates in renown. And that's the statue. Oh, you can see on the right-hand side there, the size of it compared to those people with the stroller. I don't know where it is. I should have actually rung the Brisbane City Council, the Melbourne City Council, or maybe the Brisbane City Council knocked it off because of all. These are the panels that are on the side of it, which are a very heroic. Now, they were buried in Melbourne Cemetery. Interestingly, Gray's name is on there. So no one found Gray's grave, so they've just stuck his name on there. King came back. He was very traumatised when he came back, and they had to put a stooge or, a fill-in the carriage because he was so badly traumatized by what had happened that he didn't want to face the crowds. And he did go on, but he had a fairly short life. He only lived about another 8 years afterwards. He did marry, but I don't think he ever recovered from that expedition. Were they heroes or were they tragics? Well, that's about it. I've skipped over quite a few of the details simply because I see it's 5 to 11, which is a little bit longer than I meant to go. I will stop and I'll take any questions, comments, or anything that you or any of you would like to add. But thank you for listening to me. Where's my awake person, my barometer? What's her name?
Mary.
Did you stay awake, Mary? Did you stay awake? Did I talk too much downwards or upwards?
You're not like a university lecturer at all.
Oh, okay. Is that a compliment? All right. Look, I'll take any comments. Some of you may know more about it than I do. Oh, you have to go. All right. But thank you for coming. And I'll see you next time. Yeah.
So just on the statue, it moved around a lot. I think it was originally.
Yeah, it has been in three days. That's correct. Yes.
It was then placed into what was called the city square.
Yes.
Which was the photo you showed us earlier.
Yep.
And then when the city square was remodeled, it was put on top of a fountain. And people thought that was a bit stupid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're cruel because where they were standing, just below them, a fountain sort of poured water out. So it was sort of like, because they were thirsty on home.
Well, now
That site is currently a hole where they're putting
the underground railway, isn't
That's
it?
why the statue was moved. But being Melbourne, they probably can't decide where to put it.
I think it's in storage at the present time.
But it's in storage. It's a valuable statue, but they will never agree to a new place to put it. There will be no room in the underground.
Okay. So, okay, you're obviously more up to date with that. So they're still in dispute as to what they do with it.
I've never heard of where they'll do it, but they can't make, it's the council. They can't make up their mind.
Okay.
Statues, they're out of.
Yeah, statues are out of-
anyway.
And they're colonials. You can't celebrate colonials.
Oh, that's right. We're chopping some of that. Well, of course, some people felt that it was very appropriate that the pigeons just crap on Burke's head, which is probably appropriate. Actually, I will ring them. I'll get in touch with them soon because they should. I mean, sure, it's a different era now, but they shouldn't actually lock it away. Okay. Any other?
Was there ever any sort of total summation of the cost in relation to what, you know?
It was huge, and in today's figure, it was up around the 40 million.
That's the one.
Yeah, it was sort of very expensive even at the time, but they did have the wherewithal at the time through their gold revenues. So it was pretty expensive. Interestingly, the South Australians won because they got the telegraph go through down to South Australia. And that was one of the other reasons, because the Victorians were arguing that the overland telegraph, because they were, running cable through to Asia and, ultimately back to Europe, that they were trying to get the telegraph to go down through, well, probably the Northern Territory and down into Victoria. But the South Australians sort of beat them to it, probably because it was a shorter distance, and also because they'd already stirred it, already sort of batted out. So that was another argument that was going on at the time as to where they would run the overland telegraph.
Northern Territory was part of South Australia.
Yes, that's true too. So that made it a bit easier. But the Victorians were very keen to get the overland telegraph. That was part of it. When they had the Royal Commission, there was a lot of recriminations about it, and it did come out that there was some stuff ups, but no one took accountability. Yeah.
Were there any sort of protocols in those days about crossing colonial borders? Like they went through 3 different colonies. Did they pay their dues at the Queensland border there? Their charitable?
I think there's a simple answer to that. No. You're right about South Australia being Northern Territory. I don't think the Queensland, the New South, so it went through 3 colonies, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. Well, who was going to police it? Yeah, I
was wondering whether they wrote to Governor Barwon and said, I'm coming through.
Yeah. I know nothing like that. there was quite a concerted effort by all of the, well, certainly Queensland and Victoria and the South Australia to try and rescue them. There was quite a concern about, you know, their well-being, and there was out of Brisbane, I think there was I'd have to check my facts. There was a naval vessel, you know, quite primitive, that was held by Queensland, and they sent it up around the
Well,
Gulf.
see, Lansborough went up there and
Yeah.
he landed, and he was the first one to go north to south,
Yes,
and he landed in the Gulf and ended
Yeah.
up in Melbourne.
yeah.
Not, a year or two later.
Yeah, well, Landsborough also became, his lasers, which were an L, have been confused sometimes with Leichhardt's. So, you know, there's a couple of them that we're not sure whether this was Landsborough or Leichhardt. But there are a couple of pretty fine bushmen. And you see, the other thing about Howard is he was very on side with the Aboriginal people. That's why he was able to move a lot more easily. He didn't lose anyone in his parties. And he was quite clever, and he went back in there and recovered the bodies as well. And I'm very proud of the fact that if you look at the Hume and Hobble expedition, Hume was very on side with the Aboriginal people. He'd been trained by them, he'd spent time with them, and he worked with them. And that's why I'm very emphatic about Burke really did the wrong thing by not consulting the Aboriginal people. In fact, the Aboriginal people laughed at him and thought they were absolutely stupid for eating crows. And I can believe that. You know, how much food would you get off a crow?
Yeah.
And why would you bother? It's 11 o'clock now. I think we've done our time, have we, Glenn?
Yes, I'm sure we know a lot more now about Burke and Wills, and thank you, Phil, for that presentation. As usual, very entertaining, and we'll have to get you back when you've
Finished
brushed up on
Leichhardt.
Leichhardt.
Yes. I'm hoping to find him. So if anyone finds